It's new to me as well.
Okay.
But I'm just getting into the habit. Yeah, I appreciate you you talking to me. The reason I wanted to talk is because we have interacted a lot online and shared things, and we support each other's work. And so I wanted to explore that, and also like maybe argue a bit, because I like that we clash a bit. And I don't want to just debate people forever. I want to actually figure shit out and get
Yeah.
past some of those blocks, right? And so we all
Yeah.
recognize that that's difficult over Facebook. That can lead to
Yeah.
more polarization. So yeah, so I thought it'd be good to try to talk things out.
Yes.
And
Of course, there are some things that where people are just different, and so
mhm,
sometimes you have to accept that that we agree on this and this, but we just disagree on another thing.
yeah,
And yeah, so
exactly.
I think the conversation about identity politics will not be too easy, but yeah, let's go for it.
Yeah, I mean, you did give a little a supportive plug of my intellectual dark web critique, and that means a lot because, like, you don't have to agree with the whole thing, right? But to agree with the basic critique, the basic substance of argument, I think is important because a lot of people struggle with it. And
Yeah,
so, we can kind of, compartmentalize identity politics. Like, I think it goes both ways. It's necessary sometimes and it's dangerous sometimes, right? Like white
yeah,
supremacy is identity politics that is still happening. So we can sideline that. But my one of my fundamental issues with the IDW is that it's not reflexive. It's not reformist in any way. It's not taking in these critiques, and the critiques don't just come from me. It comes from the entire left that the IDW criticizes. And so if we are all on kind of the left end of the spectrum, we should be able to work together and talk to each other. And especially the way politics is headed, like,
yeah,
you're much more of a leftist than they are, right? They really obstructed the public discourse. They obstructed the Bernie Sanders movement. And for me, these things clearly dovetail, with the
well,
commons,
yeah. So um, I mean, the IDW is a very complex thing. There's people that have various degrees of left right mixtures.
yeah,
Um, but so fundamentally for me is there is a movement today which at the same time is an expression of desire for liberation, but carries with it very serious dangers, right? So maybe some to you a bit extreme as a comparison, but let's take the Cultural Revolution in China. Um, when I was young, I was for it. Because it spoke from a desire of equality and against the bureaucracy and you know getting over the oppressions from the past. At the same time, though, very fast turned out to be a totalitarian movement that did enormous harm to China and Chinese people, and so that's a bit my contradictory feelings about what's happening today. I mean, if the movements today were just in the same line as even 5 years ago, I would be all for it. But today, I mean, once you have a professor who loses his job simply for reading Martin Luther King, you're in trouble. I mean, um, so that's what you have to see for me the IDW as a reaction to certain things, right? And I don't know if you have ever been targeted, but I have. So I've been deplatformed. I have.
yeah.
So once you have been bitch slapped or whatever it's called in English,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
it's like they say. So if every liberal who's been mugged becomes a
yeah,
reactionary, right? That's a thing.
yeah. I I
And
understand
so,
it's
so
such a
once you target it, you look at where's the help, right? Where can you find any solidarity for what is happening to you? And that's what creates, uh, potential sympathy, in my view, for the IDW, because so there's two things, when you talk about liberalism, and I would consider most of them, in the liberal tradition, but there's two aspects to liberalism. There's an economic one, and so that makes most of them are, pro-market, some of them very aggressively pro-market, and normally these people would be like, okay, I don't, I'm against this, but they're also liberal in the sense of, free speech issues and having space for, divergent discourse, etc., right? And so that's something that I want to preserve. So even if you're an integralist, transcending includes, and the question is always, well, what do you include and what do you transcend, right?
yeah.
But of course, for me, it's pretty clear that the ability to think by yourself without undue pressure is something that is really basic to our civilization, um, and that's where the left, I'm sorry to say, so for me there are parallel developments. So we are entering into an age of anxiety. There's no security for anyone. There is ecological destruction coming to us. There is economic pain, and for me this is a period that naturally leads to regression, right? So you have on the right wing, it will take ethnic, religious, nationalist complexion, and on the left, for me, it takes an identity complexion, right? And so don't misunderstand me. I'm not against identity politics as such. So when gay, trans, all
Yeah.
these people want
Yeah.
equal rights, I mean, that's like very much something that I would be in favor of.
The problem though,
But when it becomes a struggle of one identity against another, then I have a
yeah.
serious issue with it.
Yeah, and I've never been deplatformed. I've never been in the middle or the crossfire of any of that. So I, I get it. I can sympathize a bit, but I would also say that, leftists have been deplatformed by right wingers. There's not a lot of space in the public discourse for left sociologists like myself. And and also the real tragedy here is like, okay, they can criticize the excesses of identity politics or whatever, but they shouldn't dismiss the kind of socialist move Bernie Sanders is trying to make, because I think, and I
Right.
think we can agree there, like on the economic level, like, and I agree there are excessive movements, like some of the Marxist groups don't quite have a complete vision of the world, right? But I like Marxist theory, and the Bernie Sanders movement wasn't about that, right? It wasn't
Yeah.
a
Now,
classical
now
Marxist
the
movement. It's
so
more of
the
a
issue that yeah,
welfare
the issue
state
that I
basic
have,
upgrade.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So the issue I have with the IDW on that score,
Mhm.
and okay, so and I don't know enough of the details to actually judge it myself, right? So there's so they are totally focused on their fear of identity politics. That's what drives them, right? And that brings all kinds of people together in this kind of container. And what they claim, and I see no evidence for that, but who knows, is they claim that, for example, that was Brent Weinstein would say, right? He was a Bernie Sanders supporter. He was Occupy. He knows a lot of leaders of the civil rights movement. He has worked with them in the past. And so he would say things like, okay, in 2020, I no longer support Sanders because they've switched to identity politics. I have not seen evidence for that.
Yeah,
But
exactly. Yeah.
However, you look at what's her name, Elizabeth Warren. It's rife with identity politics. So
Yeah.
if
And
you look at
neoliberalism.
if you look at Project Veritas tapes, they have these tapes from Sanders and Warren. It's very different. So if you look at the Sanders tapes, they're very radical leftist in his organizing team who say things like, the Gulag wasn't that bad.
Right.
But that's not identity politics. You can agree or disagree, you know. I don't think the gulag should be justified. But anyway, so that's what I see. With the Warren staff, you see a totally focus on identity politics. And you see the few people with Warren who try to talk about, social, class social issues, they're marginalized, right?
Yeah.
So I haven't seen not evidence about Sanders being, doing that, but
Yeah.
that's what they claim. I
Yeah.
think they're wrong.
But yeah,
Yeah,
fundamentally, I think there was a very strong case for Sanders, but the mass media, of course, played a large role in suppressing that. And, the IDW was like critical of mass media. So you think they would make the connection, but
right.
it's an information problem. I would say to a lot of people, like, this is an epistemic issue. Like, we shouldn't get hung up on the moral warfare, because if we could actually determine what kind of the truth is of different policy points and stuff, then we could rally, we could organize behind it. And Bernie did surge in both elections and come very
Yeah, but
close.
here's the issue, right? The issue is that for people in the IDW, they tend to conflate the left
Yeah.
as both things together.
Right.
So you're radical on economic issues, and you're for identity politics, right? Now, this is also because on the left side there is no critique of identity politics, or it's not audible, right? And so the problem for me is policing your borders, right? So, and it does seem for me that the left has lost its immunity against those things. It's a very different thing to say we're oppressed, by a system that is, generally favors white people, and to recognize that, also white workers are oppressed and women are oppressed.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of rainbow coalition idea where, everybody has an oppression, and unity makes strength, and you build a coalition, right? But, and I'm not sure you're sensitive enough to this, but, if you look at Evergreen and what happens there, right? So here's what happens. You have meetings and they say, white people, please stay in the back. Don't touch the food and the
Yeah,
drink,
I get
right?
it. Yeah.
You have a Native American who speaks up and he slightly disagrees,
Mm-mm.
with the mass, and they
Yeah.
say, "Oh, you can't talk because you're not dark enough,"
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
I'm married in an interracial marriage. I have, mixed kids, and that really shocks me, right? I don't want to live in a world where everything becomes racialized and genderized in this particular way. And so what I see is that even the most radical black leaders, like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, he was really
Yeah.
moving to the left at the end of his life. They were totally against this, because for them the Black Panthers they call themselves communitarian federalists. But it was always in this idea of, an alliance with all the oppressed. So they remained universalist at the same time as they were developing a strategy for their own group, right? And that's
Yeah.
lost.
Yeah.
And the problem is you can't. It seems like you can't say that anymore. That if
Yeah.
so, and that's the problem. And so, if you follow this with a sensibility for the victims, right? And so now I'm not talking about the victims of racism. I'm talking about the
Right.
victims of inside that movement, where any hesitation is just radically punished.
Yeah. The tension for
That is
me,
an issue for me. Yeah.
for sure. I would, by default, I want to support the social justice people, and that's easy for me to do because I wasn't there, you know. And if they would let me support them, if I was there, I probably would. I would still be on their side. However, because I've been interested in this idea of metamodernism for a long time now, it's like I did have that kind of foresight about social justice that it was being weakened. I'll phrase it
Yeah.
that way. It's not that it was inherently weak. It was being weakened by neoliberal structures. And, there's an argument to be made for the school administration itself kind of, just breaking down and not being qualified to handle these things. And of course, the way that they're taught, there's all these problems. And so we need a meta discourse and a meta politics to help frame these things. And that's what I think the left was missing to some extent. That's why I tried to bridge these worlds and marry these ideas. Because we all want to make this kind of post-political move, but not at the expense of actual social justice, right? And the discourse has just become so distorted and muddied. Now we're in this position where we're all losers because it's Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, and it's a losing proposition.
Yeah,
and
of course, the question to be asked, is whether there actually is enough, social support for Sanders, right? Because certainly in 2016, there's a lot of arguments to be made that they cheated, right? I mean, the DNC, and I think he would have won, the primaries. But I don't think that was the case in 2020. So
such a crowded field and many other factors.
The sociological basis of the left, is maybe not as strong as it used to be. And so I want to say something about this. This is an analysis that comes both from the left and the right. So there's Thomas Piketty, the French guy who wrote the Capital 20th Century and then Capital and Ideology. And there's another guy I find very interesting on the right. His name is Emmanuel Todd, and he's a specialist in family structures. Anyway, so they both come to the same conclusion, which I agree with, which is that we now have a three-way split. Right? So you have the Brahmins, the Brahmin left, as they call them. So the cognitive class, which has a small elite, but with mostly precarious cognitive people that struggle today, but that are culturally privileged, right? They may not be financially privileged, but they're culture privileged. Then you have the merchant right, and then you have those who have neither. And I think it's a very good explanation today, which is to say that the merchant right, a fraction of the merchant right, the non-globalist fraction of the merchant right, has successfully allied with that group, which in the US would be the white workers. And I don't know if you know this, but if you look at the statistics, despite all the problems, Black people are moving up. Like there's a lot of stats, like prison population, for example, it's very high, but it's going down since 10 years in a pretty systematic way. If you're like a Black male in your 30s, with an education, things are improving in general, right? There's always exceptions, and they come from a very low gap. So they're, but if you're a white worker, you're really going down very fast. So all the characteristics that used to be characteristics of poor people living in the ghettos are now becoming. So there's more drugs. There's like the rate of suicide is much higher now in the white working class. So what I'm saying is, so these people feel oppressed.
I'm part of that class. I definitely feel
they're going down.
But I don't identify with the whiteness part, right? That's the difference. But yeah, we're all going down in a sense.
Yeah, but so the issue for me is that the new brand of identity politics is creating a backlash, and there's a lot of electoral studies showing this. I can give you one example. So in Australia, Labour was going to win, like they had like a 10% advance, right? And then there was this Polynesian football or rugby star who said something about gays, right? Something he shouldn't have said, but that is a very common prejudice in those communities. That they're mostly evangelical, and so they don't like this, right? this was then pushed in the headline of the newspapers for 2 weeks.
Right.
The result, of the left focusing on this and trying to punish the guy, and was that Labour lost, and they lost 1.4 million Polynesian votes. You see what I mean? So there is a way in which this new identity politics, which focuses on whiteness as a bad thing, feeds a reaction. Yeah, and so this is the problem with this strategy. If you support identity politics, it's a losing proposition for me. If you don't focus on common oppression, common interests, and maybe even if you're right, the issue is pragmatically you're creating a world where more and more white people are becoming afraid of what's going to happen to them if you win. Yeah. And these are the masses of the people that are moving in that direction, and that's the issue today. So if you don't have an education, and you don't have money, you're really, really worse off.
Yeah.
If you're cognitive but financially poor, you can still manage, in some ways, to get out. And the link is broken between those two forces, and identity politics reinforces that breaking point. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
So that's
yeah. My sort of position towards all politics, and I've always tried to crystallize this and be part of this wave, but is to vote for the biggest leverage for systems change. Right. All of the social justice stuff is important, but it's in everyone's interests to vote for healthcare, right? And most Americans support it, right? So it's just absurd that we're in this situation where it's effectively blocked, right? And not to be a class reductionist, right? But capitalism is kind of the enemy of us all in this sense, because it underpins politics, and the politics becomes all about money and power. So this is why I'm constantly losing my mind, because from the kind of meta perspective, things are a lot more clear. However, even in a lot of these meta modern or not intellectual circles that I'm in, like Game B, for example, like they're very anti-political and they're very kind of, anti-progressive, even though I think Bernie would have been the path to achieving their kind of systems change goals. So now the problem becomes like, okay, everybody's starting to realize that we need Medicare for all. We need a Green New Deal. I say we, I mean globally, right? We need much bigger global systemic change than even those plans provide. But it's a question.
That's why we're stuck.
How do we do it now?
So you and I mean, that's where we agree on, right? Is, we want this integrative step.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I think before we reach this, we are actually in an opposite movement.
Yeah, the culture war is at complete odds.
Yeah,
with
so
that
we are actually not in a period of integration, we're in a period of regression. And it's like when you have war and peace, that you first have to have World War II before you get United Nations. You know what I mean?
I wish it weren't true, but there's some truth to that.
So people have to see that, like in terms of ecology and resources, that there's no way out in fighting amongst each other to get the biggest part of a shrinking pie. Yeah. But they will try it first, right? They will try it first. And that's the tragedy of human society, is that unfortunately, and I don't see in the short term any way out of this.
Yeah, you probably didn't have time to see it, but I emailed you an article I published late last night.
I didn't see it.
Not just over 15 hours ago my time, and it's called Convergence for Consensus Building. Right, and I take this concept of convergence, which I developed a lot in this Smart Cities book and wrote my article about, but also the idea of consensus building, right? So I went through a bunch of sources on the concept and the process itself, and there's some good research, and what it basically suggests is that if you create the right conditions, then you can build consensus. But if you don't create the right conditions, people will be skeptical and it will fail for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And so by actually mapping out the process and making it a very reflexive, inclusive process, we can actually do it. And that's the structure. But then the question is, okay, what kind of content do you put in there? What kind of consensus are you trying
But
to build?
some people in the IDW is exactly what they're doing. So you have
I don't see them building any consensus of any kind, but I'm trying to create the structure and also add some
I
of the
mean, if you look at
content.
the work of James Lindsay, you know, that's they're trying to have this idea of good conversations. So
I've had nothing but I've had and I've seen bad interactions with that guy. I think he's totally disingenuous. And it's the irony of writing a book called Impossible Conversations, but then you can't actually have conversations outside your bubble.
So, but here's the thing, and we have the same problem in a different way. So in my view, you are uncritical of identity politics. Yeah, that's my view.
Yeah.
And so in my view, and in the view of the IDW, they see you as somebody who justifies all kinds of suppressive behavior, right? And
I've never critiqued identity politics, but I've never justified any of that type of stuff either, right? So
I'm just explaining the dynamics, and for me it's the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
So because I critique identity politics, I'm also rejected.
Right.
Okay, by a small but very influential part on the left, which is the loudest right? And there's no way out. There's that's where we're stuck, right? I feel a lot like the conservatives that were overrun by Trump.
Sure.
Right. Sure. Even 5 years ago, I would have been considered a leftist. You know, I'm for redistribution of wealth. I'm for deep ecological transition. Yeah. But I'm also universalist.
See, I'm glad though that you're transparent about that with me and about the issues with identity politics, because I do think if we put the time in, they could be hashed out. And the consensus building process, you know, with facilitators and mediators and a ton of source material, you know, so we're actually having some common knowledge, not just going off Lindsay's book or something, but like, you know, teachers and building trust and, you know, bonding. There's so many elements of this process, which I think invites and incentivizes it, because there is a kind of light at the end of the tunnel.
There is. So as the show goes, you know, let's hope it's not an incoming train from the other side.
Exactly. Yeah.
But you know, I mean, that's my frame as well. You're probably familiar with Peter Pogani, which, you know, I think I have it here. Maybe not. Yeah, this is a really good one. And so, you know, the basic idea is that, you know, societies unfortunately are complex adaptive systems. So they don't change through reason. They change because one stable system no longer functions, goes into chaotic transition, and out of that cauldron of change comes a new, you know, stability. But you have to go through, you know, that depth phase, you know, where you're really going down.
Yeah.
And so the work basically of the P2P Foundation is, you know, how can we create structures that are resilient to go to that period, right? And I see the commons as a way to overcome some of the issues with identity politics, because if, you know, and it's both ideologically and in terms of, you know, diversity. So in the sense that if I want to do free software, you know, I got to work with libertarian programmers. There's no choice. Like, they're there.
Right.
And we agree on we disagree on many things, but we both want to do the same free software, right?
Right.
So that requires like a bracketing of some of the differences and conflicts, because you have this kind of love for the common object that you're co-constructing. And that's also, you know, where identity politics is a big issue. I've spoken to many people now who say, you know, like there was an Australian woman, and she succeeded, I think it was in New South Wales, to build a coalition with, you know, the majority group, with the farmers, with indigenous people. Basically, everybody coalesced against fracking, right? And she says now it's impossible to do
Right. Yeah.
because the, you know,
Yeah.
people will attack each other's identity, and there
Yeah.
go the farmers go away, and then the
Yeah.
other white people go away. And I've seen
Yeah.
this in Madison. I was there in 2016, and you know, in nearly all the progressive meetings I went to, the same dynamic. You know, people started shouting, but by lunchtime, white activists were gone. You know, because they had no interest in being attacked, you know, all the time, and so they kind of, you know, disappeared one by one. And I was usually the only one left because, you know, I was not American, so I wasn't.
Yeah.
I felt I wasn't part of that dynamic. But this is a very problematic,
Yeah. And
uh, you know, way of going about things. It's
yeah, I think I can admit, you know, that I fall into the trap sometimes and I'll get mad at a white person because that particular person probably doesn't actually understand systemic racism that much. So I get mad and, you know, I kind of call them a white person.
yeah,
But but I think, you know, it's so in the case of Black Lives Matter, this is what I would say. It's not that it's inherently wrong. I think they have a legitimate cause, but I would describe it as a paradox, right? So this whole situation is paradoxical, and
right,
we don't treat it as a paradox, then we can't solve it as a paradox, right? So to
right.
look at it as a paradox is to admit that they're fundamentally right, but then also that
Well, they can be right about some things and wrong about
right,
others.
yeah,
You know, what I
exactly,
mean,
and yeah,
they
and
focus on one particular thing, and
yeah, and even it,
um,
yeah, and regardless of the degrees of truth, the media, you know, distorts the message, the receiver distorts the message, right? And so it becomes paradoxical because no matter what we do, it gets worse. You
yeah,
know, so the Bernie Sanders movement was actually the best chance to avoid kind of
yeah.
all these
But
like identity
yeah,
politics.
I mean, abolition of the police is, I think it's a good example. You have, I mean, you know, just to make it clear, I'm for deep transformation of police, right?
Yeah,
Like they did,
demilitarization.
yeah, yeah. So you basically abolish it, but not really.
Yeah,
What you mean is you start over and you start selecting, you know, policemen who are of the good type,
yeah,
and you create a wholly different kind of policing.
and you invest in social work
At
and things that
Yeah, yeah,
barely exist
exactly.
these
At the
days,
same
right?
time, you know, I think in a class society with all the issues we have, not to have police is to call for private policing, and that's going to be
Oh, yeah,
worse,
that's worse.
right?
Yeah.
Which is the point of view of Sanders, but you know,
Mhm.
he's in a tough spot right now because he's, you know, being accused of being a sellout by these people, right? But so you look at it, you see that 80% of black people are in favor of the police, and 30% want more police, right? So this is a particular kind of people, right? They lots of students. They probably live in the safer parts of the city, um, and you know that doesn't represent, you know, even the people from their own group, right? And that potentially could create a backlash, right? Because um, yeah, people, you know, if you live in a poor neighborhood with high crime rates, you feel unprotected, and you know, maybe the police is and actually it is abusive in many ways, um, but I'm not sure that you prefer, you know, the narco gangs to be in charge either. You know what I mean? So you're in a different life
Yeah.
situation.
It's
Um,
yeah, it's difficult for
and
me to explain and sell my
yeah,
vision of politics to people because I want to see everything change all at once, right? The war on drugs has
yeah,
to be ended, and that's actually
yeah,
something that the IDW agrees with. But yeah,
yeah,
that has to be ended. You know, the military industrial complex has to be drawn down and scaled down. There need and eliminated eventually. and there needs to be a big push into, you know, renewable energy, and that's a complicated subject, and, you know, nuclear power to some extent, and healthcare, obviously, the whole set of changes. And I think this is what a meta perspective enables, you know, and in terms of theory and scope and scale
Yes,
of change, you
but
can level up, but it's really tough
sometimes the
to communicate.
temporality is wrong, you know.
Yeah, and that's where,
um,
like, I'd love to unpack the time frame aspect of it, because there's
yeah,
debates. You know, lots of us will agree on what has to happen, but disagree on how fast and what cultural moments we have to wait for and
yeah,
things like that. Because I'm thinking about, you know, the singularity coming around the end of this decade, or a series of singularities, and also the climate change window given by the UN. So we should be
yeah,
compelled to accelerate our
yeah,
convergence of action, right? This is why I want to
yeah,
build consensus.
right.
Consensus around basic things that shouldn't be too contentious, right? We can start with simple truths like the earth revolves around the sun, and
Yeah,
work up to, like, okay, we need to scale down the military industrial complex and have a global Green New Deal plus, you know,
yeah, yeah.
and yeah,
It's I mean, you know, basically in the commons movement, you know, what I think some people are doing is, you know, taking a longer view, right? And so how do you build community resilience? You know, where's our food coming from? Where's our energy coming from? And so you try to commodify, you know, kind of what you can, starting with low-hanging fruit first, and this kind of building seed forms that can, you know, resist the difficult time. And the way I see the same about ideas is right now, you know, for me, it's not going in the right direction, but this is going to hit a wall. You know,
yeah,
it's like the Cultural Revolution. It's going to go to its extremes. It's going to become self-destructive, and, you know, and then what?
yeah.
Uh,
Mm-mm.
but I think there are too many contradictions in the current form of identity politics to be a way forward. I you know, maybe I'm wrong. But I don't think this is, you know, this is not going to work. That's
Yeah,
my profound feeling about it. And but
it,
before we reach that stage, you know, it's going to be another 5, 10, 15 years of
yeah,
this. Yeah.
I, you
And
know,
don't forget that the other side is also organizing, right?
yeah,
So it's you know, it's this process of fragmentation that is going on.
yeah,
Um and you know, very often what I see is social racism, right? So you're you're for social justice, but the way you go about it is demonizing, you know, a section of the working class, and behaving, you know, I mean, you have to see these scenes where, you know, some rich person, you know, but SCW oriented, sits down in Uber cab and starts yelling at the driver because he has a Hawaiian, you know,
mm,
thing.
yeah,
And for me, that is really not healthy, because you know, you're attacking people who don't have, you know, the same values and the same subtleties and understanding of what it means for you. And so this is creating like a social, um, and I think that's why Trump is appealing, because in a way, you know, he's uneducated himself, you know,
yeah,
like even though he's a
yeah,
rich guy and powerful and everything, but he, you know, he has that same roughness that they can identify with, you know,
yeah.
on
This,
a atavistic level, on a you know,
yeah,
just identification level, right?
this idea of
Um,
paradox comes back to me, because, you know, we can admit that there's a kind of identity problem all across the spectrum, but then it's not of the same type, right? So the excessive progressive person who wants to, you know, take down the Hawaiian thing, right? Because they think it's culturally a cultural appropriation and insensitive.
right.
At the other end of the spectrum, right, you have all these, you know, the term Karens, right? Like, it's very generalizing, but it's like a white woman who's oversensitive about race and wants to call the cops on people, right? And so
Right. Okay.
in terms of proportion, like those are two different things.
Yeah.
And also it's an open question of what is actually occurring more. But at any rate, everybody's sensitive to all of it, right? And so it
Yeah.
creates
Yeah.
these paradoxical conditions of the deepening
But
red.
I think fear plays a big role, and because I lived in the States when I was 17, and I lived with a racist, really racist white family.
Mm-mm.
Um, but I would have to say that the overriding reason, for them, as they saw it, to be racist was fear, right? It
Yeah,
was not
yeah.
like I want to oppress you. It was like, they're gonna they're gonna mug me. They're gonna one day we were
Mm,
driving on a highway and she ran out of gas, and the panic, totally irrational panic of like
yeah,
they're coming from me,
yeah,
so that is I think a huge driver of it, and that's of course is related to social inequality and
yeah,
and
yeah,
and the whole system of hopelessness that's created.
yeah. So I think we
And
agree
yes,
that,
objectively the only way out is actually for me essentially you know class politics first, right?
yeah,
And within that frame you have uh you know civil rights and everything else, but you that's why I think Occupy was still for me a more healthy movement, because it was for the 99%, right?
yeah, yeah,
As opposed to, I think the movements that are emerging today, they can't do that.
yeah. And
They, I mean,
it's
they will
it's
have college
crazy.
kids with them and stuff, but ultimately,
That metaphor
uh,
of the
yeah,
99% is
yeah,
so salient. And that was 9 years ago. Things
that
are
was
way
brilliant. That
worse.
was brilliant. Yeah,
Things are way worse now, though. It's like
yeah,
the 99.9%, or,
yeah,
it's just things are way more unequal. And so that's the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
insanity.
yeah. Look, this is
We
another book I recommend to you. I don't have it here. It's called Capitalist Power. And it basically argues that it's not capital as power, but capital is power, right?
Mhm.
So they see the history of capitalism as a history of differential accumulation. So how dominant groups gradually increase their hold, over time. And what's very clear is that every crisis strengthens, uh,
Yeah,
which is counterintuitive, right? You would say, well, COVID is affecting everybody.
right.
Well, no, right? The big financial groups get 90% of the support, and everybody else is in trouble, so they start buying up, these
Yeah.
weakened assets, and so you end up with even more concentration than before.
There's certainly these kind of laws of history that just overwhelm the individual, even the
Yeah,
thinker. Um, and so, it'd be responsible for me to kind of be a realist and accept that.
yeah,
However, I kind of feel that we're at this different moment, this new paradigm, if you will, where we have to kind of outsmart history. And that,
yeah,
like we talked about time, like maybe I'm just too ahead of the curve, and it makes me stupid.
yeah.
I'm missing the big picture. But
Well,
I
I
think
mean,
we
you
have
you
to,
have to accept it as an integral thinker or meta modern
yeah,
thinker that by definition you're in the minority.
yeah. This
There's,
is why I take
I mean,
issue with other intellectuals, right? Because
yeah,
it's one thing for the culture to be driven, as you put it, to be driven apart. That's one thing, right? There's so many factors behind that. It's another thing for intellectuals who are privileged, highly educated. They have a responsibility to just talk about this stuff so recklessly, and the voices that get popular aren't the best ones, right? The more critical, nuanced voices, even if they're white men, right, get kind of
yeah,
cast aside. Like Chris Hedges, right? Chris Hedges is like a famous journalist and a great thinker, but you don't hear from much him outside this or that small outlet. It's a
yeah,
very complex message he's trying to deliver.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I wish the Bernie movement consolidated more, because I think it could have won. I think history could have been different, but now we're at this point.
Well, I mean, it doesn't stop, right? I'm confused right now myself about, how things are going to move politically. I'm quite pessimistic. I think the left is, is kind of disintegrating. And that's probably where, will remain different, is that I do think identity politics is the agent of destruction. Um, and um, and it's hard to fathom what will come after. But the one thing is sure is that in a class society, that polarity will always exist, and it will find expression, but it may not find the expression that we like, right? So, for example, fascism was an expression of declining middle classes, and they had a workers' wing, and Trumpism is an expression of that, right? I mean, we may not like it, but
Yeah.
so that's a big question for me: is what kind of and do you know about the Foundation trilogy of Asimov?
I know of it. I haven't read it,
Yeah,
but
it's
I'm
interesting.
aware of
So
what
it's
it's about.
basically a science fiction book, but
Yeah.
he uses the frame of Roman history, the Roman Empire, at the galactic scale. And so he has two foundations. One is the foundation that runs the world, but there's another foundation which is called the Institute for Psychohistory.
Right.
And basically, they're the ones working on the very long term, psychosocial rhythms.
Right.
And I'm working on this right now. So I wrote this introduction called the temporal. I don't forgot the title, but I can send it to you. And so I'm looking at all the people that are working on rhythms. So you have biophysical economics, Peter Turchin, cryodynamics. You have
Yeah.
Kondratiev cycles. You have Polanyi, Carlota
Yeah.
Perez.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. And so I'm coming to this kind of, preliminary synthesis of. So you have, extractive waves and regenerative waves. So basically, competition between extractive societies leads to overuse, collapse, and then you have a regenerative phase. And that's where the commons are kind of the key healing institution
Right.
that reestablishes more balance between humans and nature and between humans. And so I think this is going to happen. It's just a question of,
Yeah.
you know, uh, having the resilience to go through all the the signs of disaster
Yeah. I do
that come
like
with a
that kind of
huge
stuff.
crisis.
I like that kind of stuff too. The kind of high theory of cycles, and it's very historically materialist too. And
Yeah,
I hold back a little bit though, partly because some of the math is like over my head, but also
yeah,
partly because with any abstraction, right, there's a risk of like reification and kind of
yes, yeah,
naturalization, right? So I'm really wary of that. And
yeah,
like there's what is it, generational theory, is also, and
yeah,
actually
yeah.
there's
I haven't read those yet. I mean, I have read about it, but
mhm. Yeah,
yeah,
it's interesting. Some people call it pseudoscience, and I would recognize that it's qualitative for sure,
yeah,
not necessarily pseudoscience,
yeah,
but
yeah,
but yeah, it's all useful. But at the end of the day, like, yeah, I'm trying to parse all that with politics, the political mood, and what's
yeah,
possible, and also my own kind of high theory. Um,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I have 5 more minutes, and then I need to get moving.
cool. Yeah,
So I won't be much online for the next week because I'm
okay.
going to Bangkok and I have to do a lot of administrative stuff. Um, yeah, um, yeah. So so at the personal level, So, I'm highly reactive to identity politics. I can't help it. I feel
Mm,
it's, for me, it's profoundly threatening. Um, because the way I see it, it's the war of all against, right? So, for example, one of the things I was attacked on was saying I think ultimately men and women should be friends, which for me is like so obvious, but no, that was like the demon speaking.
yeah,
So I got like reaction like you couldn't be more wrong, right? Okay, so men and women cannot be friends. So okay, so for me, I feel existentially this, I'm like really against it, and it creates a reaction, and and I lost 2/3 of my income, so these people did real harm to me and my family, and so I anyway. Um, but I see the opposite in you, which is you get angry about IDW, right? And I do feel that your last articles are too emotional compared to what you wrote even a few years ago. I don't
sure.
think that's a good thing. Yeah,
Well, those
because
the
you start judging them on the basis of what they
well,
say
hold on a
about you,
second
which
here.
is
Yeah,
yeah.
but just to clarify,
Like
part of
your last article, Game
yeah,
Butt or whatever it's
yeah,
called, right?
yeah, yeah.
I
Game
I think it
bullshit
would be
question
much
mark.
better if yeah.
Well, yeah, I gotta qualify it though. Like, so there is a substantive argument on one hand,
Yeah,
and then the other part is I admit the kind of emotional attacks,
yeah,
but that's because I was attacked first, right? And
right.
this isn't a question of like, oh, who shot first. It's like I am making a substantive argument
Yeah,
that
yeah,
I entered that space and was kind of not treated well from the beginning just for having ideas about sociology, like not even
right,
social justice, just being trained
right,
in sociology. People think, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, right? And so
right.
this is a general bias out in the world of like people who study science or psychology just think they know everything
Mm.
about politics automatically. So
Yeah,
there
yeah,
was personal attacks towards me first, and I felt it. Even though you're right that me making that argument might turn off readers, I felt it necessary to package it with the substance
yeah,
because it reflects on how they treat people, right? And
yeah,
so
yeah,
it does go both ways. And so you're right.
yeah,
Those two articles were a little bit hostile on purpose, but the
yeah.
consensus building one is not. It's only 4,000 words, and
Okay,
it's designed as a follow up to those to be
right.
more inviting, more objective,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
more
yeah.
yeah.
Well, so my critique is a bit different. Um, so I didn't know this at first, but they kind of all come from the Santa Fe Institute-ish, kind of thinking, which makes it very abstract at the system level, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the old critiques, I don't know if you know Richard Lewontin. He was a great biologist, Marxist biologist, from like 40 years ago. He he wrote really good critiques of systems theory as ahistorical, right?
Right.
So it's kind of an abstraction where you all become a dot, an agent in a system,
Yeah, yeah.
right? It's also, I think, the subtle reductionist critique of Ken Wilber, and I agree with those, right?
Yeah.
Um, so my difficulty with them is that they stay at this very high level of abstraction, um, and then they have the same problem as integral theory and maybe even modernists have, which is by claiming this understanding of everything, they attract people who use it as a psychological mechanism to elevate themselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I see a lot of people in the game B that are, in my view, like not game B at all.
Right. No, exactly. And
uh,
that's a
um,
good point to end on
and
because I
and
appreciate
you
that
find
point.
that in the integral, you find it in every integral movement. I'm
Yeah.
I'm what is it, like, turquoise, and
Right.
you're just mean green, this
Exactly.
kind of you find that in there. But I'm still very much interested in what they're doing, because basically what you know, my approach is about in the commons is actually about non-rival games, right? It's about the idea that mutualization creates abundance, right? By pooling resources, suddenly you need a lot less resources and everybody can access them rather than slicing them up in a competitive environment. So that's what I'm interested in Game B, is that they,
Yeah,
you know, they're trying to refound economics and everything on this basis of how can we redesign, you know, society and institutions based on these new principles, which I think that is very valuable.
for sure.
But they don't know the commons, so and
Yeah, and they don't know the
you know, so I
history,
think there's a
as you
potential
said.
for fruitful dialogue. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that's what happened to you probably and Vinay, is they
yeah,
overly sensitive to disruptive
yeah,
things, and so they might overreact to people who they think will just bring, you know, disruption in the communication.
yeah, exactly. So if we
That's
can
like,
all admit our mistakes, we can
yeah,
move on as quickly as possible.
yeah.
So, you know, all
All
of this
right.
is to be continued for me, you
Yeah.
know, always.
Okay.
It's not, nothing's ever over.
Yeah. So I'm wrapping up. So I'm working this summer on a introduction to commons economics. And then for 3 years, I have this project of working on the history of the world according to the commons. So, you know, following this framing, I want to take some key moments in history and see how the commons kind of play. So that's, so I'm a bit in retreat myself. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
okay, this is not a good moment right now to be, you know, playing in the foam.
Hmm.
So let's go back a bit to the undercurrents and, you know, prepare for the next favorable moment where is fruitful.
Yeah.
We're in here for the long. We're in here for the long haul, and
That's a good way to put it. I'm kind of in the same boat, and and yeah, I look forward to your book, and I plan to write a lot this summer as well.
yeah.
We're being broken up here. The connection's fading. Are you there?
Can you hear me?
It's very choppy. The picture's frozen.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave. So
Okay.
right.
Thanks for your
So
time,
yeah, I got to
Michel.
go.
All right.
Um, yeah, yeah. All
Sorry,
right.
sorry for the choppy signal at the
Okay.
end. Talk
Yeah,
to you
we can
later.
do this again.
Sounds good. Take care.
Yeah.